Carl Jung made a discovery so disturbing that he kept it hidden in his private journals for decades. It wasn't about mental illness or psychological disorders. It was about a specific type of person who possesses what he called the curse of hyperperception. Individuals who see psychological patterns, hidden emotions, and unconscious motives with such clarity that it destroys their ability to live normally. Jung documented these people in his clinical practice starting in 1910, but he rarely spoke about them publicly because their condition challenged everything psychology believed about human perception and social functioning. These weren't psychics or mystics. They were ordinary people whose brains had developed what Jung termed unconscious radar, the ability to detect emotional states, personality patterns, and behavioral predictions with startling accuracy. They could walk into a room and immediately sense who was lying, who was in pain, who harbored secret resentments, and who was on the verge of a breakdown. But Jung discovered something terrifying about this gift. The more clearly these individuals saw others' hidden psychological content, the more isolated and psychologically unstable they became. Not because they were mentally ill, but because seeing everything others miss comes with a psychological price that Jung called the perception penalty. Today, I'm revealing Jung's forbidden research about people cursed with hyperperception, why he believed this ability is both humanity's greatest asset and its most dangerous psychological liability, and the integration method he developed that transforms this curse into what he called conscious sight. Because here's what Jung discovered that modern psychology still refuses to acknowledge. Some people aren't meant to live in consensus reality. They're meant to see beyond it, but only if they learn to survive what they see. Jung's breakthrough came through a patient he described only as Subject H in his private notes from 1912. She was a 28-year-old woman who came to him not for typical psychological problems, but for what she described as seeing too much. Jung wrote, "The patient possesses an uncanny ability to perceive what I can only describe as the psychological undercurrents of human interaction. She reports sensing emotions that others haven't expressed, detecting deceptions before they're revealed, and predicting behavioral patterns with disturbing accuracy." Initially, Jung suspected this was a form of intuitive intelligence or heightened empathy. But as he studied her case more deeply, he realized he was observing something unprecedented in psychological literature. Subject H can describe the emotional state, core fears, and unconscious motivations of strangers within minutes of meeting them, Jung recorded. "When I verify her observations through independent assessment, they prove accurate in ways that exceed statistical probability." But Jung noticed something alarming. The more accurate her perceptions became, the more psychologically distressed she grew. She reported feeling like she was living in a glass house of human consciousness where everyone's hidden thoughts and feelings were visible to her, but her insights were invisible to everyone else. Jung documented her describing what he came to call perception overwhelm. "I see the sadness behind every smile, the fear behind every confident gesture, the loneliness behind every social interaction. I cannot unsee what I see, and I cannot share what I see without being labeled as negative, judgmental, or delusional." This case led Jung to identify what he termed hyperperceptive syndrome, a condition where individuals develop such advanced psychological perception that they can no longer participate normally in social reality. Jung wrote, "These individuals have not lost touch with reality. They have gained too much contact with psychological reality. They see the unconscious patterns that govern human behavior so clearly that consensual social interaction becomes impossible." Through years of clinical observation, Jung identified 4 distinct patterns of hyperperception, each representing a different way the unconscious mind processes hidden psychological information. Jung called these individuals feeling vampires, not because they drained emotions, but because they absorbed them so completely they lost track of their own emotional center. These patients report feeling the unexpressed emotions of everyone in their environment, Jung noted. A husband's hidden resentment, a child's suppressed fear, a colleague's mass depression, all become as real to them as their own feelings. Jung observed that emotional mirrors often developed what he called psychological porosity. Their psychic boundaries became so permeable that distinguishing between their emotions and absorbed emotions became nearly impossible. The danger, they would take on other psychological problems as their own, leading to depression, anxiety, and identity confusion that had no apparent personal cause. Jung documented individuals who could predict human behavior with uncanny accuracy, not through logical analysis, but through what he called unconscious pattern recognition. They observe subtle behavioral cues and psychological markers that allow them to forecast relationship failures, career disasters, and personal breakdowns months before they occur. Jung wrote, pattern prophets could sense when someone was about to quit their job, end their marriage, or have a psychological breakdown simply by observing unconscious behavioral patterns others couldn't detect. The danger, being right about negative predictions, made them appear pessimistic and toxic to others, leading to social rejection despite their accuracy. These individuals possessed what Jung called deception radar, the ability to sense lies, manipulations, and hidden agendas with remarkable precision. Jung noted, they detect inconsistencies between conscious presentation and unconscious truth. When someone says they're fine while harboring deep emotional pain, the truth detector feels the contradiction as a physical discomfort. Truth detectors couldn't engage in normal social interactions because they sensed the deceptions, self-deceptions, and hidden motivations underlying most human communication. The danger, they became unable to participate in the social contracts that require polite fiction and convenient denial, making them appear confrontational or unstable. The rarest type Jung encountered could perceive what he called group consciousness patterns, the unconscious dynamics operating within families, organizations, and communities. These individuals sense the unspoken rules, hidden conflicts, and collective shadows that govern group behavior, Jung observed. They feel the emotional atmosphere of entire systems and can predict group dynamics with startling accuracy. Collective sensors often became the identified problem in every system they entered, not because they caused issues, but because they unconsciously reflected the group's hidden dysfunctions. The danger, they attracted blame and scapegoating from groups whose unconscious patterns they inadvertently exposed. If you recognize yourself in any of these types, comment, I see what others miss. Jung discovered that hyperperception creates what he called the isolation spiral, a psychological pattern where superior perception leads to social rejection, which intensifies perception, which deepens isolation. Hyperperceptive individuals begin noticing patterns others miss. They might gently suggest that someone seems upset or point out obvious problems in relationships or work situations. Jung noted, the initial response is typically dismissal or denial. Others cannot see what the hyperperceptive person sees, so they assume the perception is incorrect rather than considering their own perceptual limitations. When their observations prove accurate, hyperperceptive people often experience what Jung called truth punishment, being blamed for creating the problems they're simply observing. The family member who points out addiction patterns gets labeled as dramatic. The employee who notices organizational dysfunction gets branded as negative. The friend who sees relationship red flags gets accused of being judgmental, Jung documented. After repeated invalidation, hyperperceptive individuals often stop sharing their observations entirely. Jung called this perception suppression, the conscious decision to ignore what you see to maintain social acceptance. Jung wrote, this stage is particularly dangerous because suppressing authentic perception creates internal psychological conflict. The individual begins doubting their own perceptual abilities while simultaneously feeling frustrated by others' apparent blindness. The final stage involves what Jung termed perceptual dissociation, disconnecting from their own perceptive abilities to avoid psychological pain. Some individuals convince themselves their perceptions were wrong all along, Jung observed. Others develop what they call selective blindness, choosing to see only what others can see. Both approaches create profound psychological suffering because they require rejecting a fundamental aspect of their psychological nature. Jung discovered that society actively suppresses hyperperceptive individuals because they threaten what he called collective unconscious agreements, the shared decisions about what will and won't be acknowledged. Every family, organization, and culture maintains unconscious contracts about which truths can be spoken and which must remain hidden, Jung noted. The hyperperceptive individual violates these contracts simply by existing authentically. Jung identified specific ways society punishes superior perception, labeling perceptive individuals as too sensitive, negative, or dramatic, excluding them from social groups and professional opportunities. questioning their mental stability when their observations prove accurate, demanding they prove their perceptions while dismissing their evidence, making them responsible for others' emotional reactions to uncomfortable truths. Jung wrote, "The hyperperceptive individual becomes a psychological mirror that society cannot bear to look into. Rather than examining what the mirror reveals, it's easier to attack the mirror itself." Jung developed what he called the conscious perception protocol, a systematic approach to integrating hyperperceptive abilities without psychological destruction. Jung realized that hyperperceptive individuals first needed to validate their own abilities, rather than seeking validation from others who couldn't perceive what they perceived. Begin documenting your observations, Jung instructed. Keep a private record of your perceptions and their eventual accuracy. This creates an evidence base for your own abilities, independent of others' validation. Jung taught patients to trust their perceptions while learning to share them strategically, rather than seeking constant confirmation from perceptually limited individuals. Jung taught hyperperceptive individuals how to share their insights without triggering defensive reactions from others. The art lies not in seeing less truthfully, but in communicating truth in ways that others can receive, Jung observed. His strategic disclosure method assessed the person's capacity for psychological insight before sharing observations. Frame perceptions as questions rather than statements. "I'm curious if you've been feeling." Share observations gradually rather than overwhelming others with everything you see. Focus on perceptions that serve the other person's growth rather than validating your abilities. Accept that some people cannot handle psychological truth regardless of how gently it's shared. The final phase involved what Jung called transformed perception, using hyperperceptive abilities in conscious service of healing rather than unconscious absorption of problems. Jung wrote, "The integrated hyperperceptive individual becomes a bridge between conscious and unconscious reality. They help make the unconscious conscious in others without sacrificing their own psychological integrity." This requires developing what Jung called compassionate detachment, the ability to see clearly while remaining emotionally centered, to witness others' psychological patterns without becoming entangled in them. Jung documented remarkable transformations in patients who successfully integrated their hyperperceptive abilities. Subject H, his original case study, became what Jung called a conscious mirror, someone who could reflect psychological truth in ways that promoted healing rather than defensiveness. Many of Jung's successfully integrated patients found careers that utilized their perceptive gifts constructively, therapists and counselors who could quickly identify core psychological issues, teachers who could sense students' learning blocks and emotional needs, leaders who could navigate complex group dynamics and organizational challenges, artists and writers who could capture psychological truths others couldn't articulate, Jung noted. When hyperperception is integrated consciously, it becomes a professional superpower rather than a personal curse. Integrated hyperperceptive individuals developed what Jung called conscious intimacy, the ability to see others completely while loving them unconditionally. They learned to distinguish between seeing someone's psychological patterns and judging them for those patterns, Jung observed. This created relationships of unprecedented depth and authenticity. Instead of being rejected for seeing too much, they began attracting people who valued being truly seen and understood. Jung believed that integrated hyperperceptive individuals serve a crucial evolutionary function for human consciousness. They serve as early warning systems for collective psychological problems, Jung wrote. They sense societal patterns before they manifest as cultural crises, helping humanity address psychological issues before they become destructive. Jung predicted that, as more hyperperceptive individuals learned integration, humanity would develop greater psychological awareness and emotional intelligence collectively. Jung identified 4 progressive levels of hyperperceptive mastery that individuals could achieve through conscious integration. Level 1, conscious recognition. You acknowledge your perceptive abilities without shame while learning to distinguish between your own psychological content and what you absorb from others. Level 2, selective engagement. You choose when and with whom to engage your perceptive abilities rather than being overwhelmed by constant unconscious absorption. Level 3, healing presence. Your integrated perception becomes a gift that helps others become more conscious of their own psychological patterns without feeling judged or exposed. Level 4, cultural medicine. You use your abilities to contribute to collective psychological evolution, helping society become more conscious of patterns that need healing or transformation. Jung wrote, the individual who reaches level 4 mastery serves not as a victim of superior perception, but as a conscious agent of psychological evolution. Remember Jung's profound insight about people cursed with hyperperception. The curse lies not in seeing too much, but in failing to develop conscious relationship with what you see. Your ability to perceive what others miss isn't a psychological malfunction. It's an advanced feature of consciousness that requires sophisticated integration skills. Jung believed that hyperperceptive individuals represent humanity's evolutionary edge, people whose consciousness has developed beyond current collective limitations, preparing the way for psychological development that society isn't yet ready to embrace. The question isn't whether you should suppress your perception to fit into consensus reality. The question is whether you'll develop the integration skills necessary to use your perception as Jung intended, as conscious service to psychological evolution. Your hyperperception is not your burden. Your unconscious relationship to your perception is your burden. Learn to integrate it consciously, and you become exactly what Jung believed humanity desperately needs: a bridge between what is and what's becoming. If you recognize yourself as someone who sees everything others miss, share this video with others walking the same path. Your integration journey connects with a rare psychological type that Jung considered essential for consciousness evolution. Subscribe for more insights into Jung's discoveries about psychological development that transcends ordinary limitations. Your gift of seeing everything isn't too much for this world. Once you learn to wield it consciously, it becomes exactly what consciousness evolution requires. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.